Imagine opening a wooden cupboard, reaching past jars that have been sitting quietly for years, twisting open a simple lid, and eating food that was harvested before your youngest child was even born. No freezer, no refrigerator, no electricity, just time. To most of us, that sounds impossible. We've been taught that food begins spoiling the moment it leaves the grocery store. Power goes out for a few hours, people rush to save everything inside the refrigerator. A freezer fails overnight, hundreds of dollars worth of food can disappear in a single day. Modern life has convinced us that electricity is the only thing standing between us and hunger. But for centuries, one country quietly proved otherwise: Japan. Long before refrigerators arrived in Japanese homes, families had already mastered something far more remarkable. They learned how to preserve food not for weeks, not for months, but sometimes for decades. Some traditional ingredients are still intentionally aged for 10, 15, even 20 years before they're considered ready to eat. And unlike emergency survival food packed inside metal cans, these foods often become more valuable with time. Their flavors deepen, their aromas become richer, their nutritional qualities sometimes improve. In many cases, older means better. That raises an extraordinary question. How can food survive 20 years without refrigeration? The answer has almost nothing to do with technology. It begins with understanding one simple truth. Food doesn't spoil because time passes. Food spoils because tiny living organisms find everything they need to grow: moisture, warmth, oxygen. Once those three conditions exist together, bacteria, molds, and yeasts begin breaking food apart. Japanese food preservation rarely fights nature. Instead, it quietly removes one of those conditions. Sometimes moisture disappears, sometimes oxygen, sometimes harmful microbes are replaced by helpful ones. Rather than preventing change, Japanese preservation methods carefully guide it. To understand how this philosophy developed, we have to travel back more than 1,000 years. Japan is a nation of mountains. Nearly 3/4 of its land is rugged terrain. Flat farmland has always been limited. Long winters in the north, typhoons in the south, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions. Throughout history, food security could never be taken for granted. Families learned early that surviving winter depended on preparation during summer. Fishing villages faced another challenge. Fresh fish spoils quickly. Long before ice machines existed, coastal communities needed ways to preserve enormous catches. Throwing food away wasn't an option. Neither was eating everything immediately. Necessity became invention, and invention gradually became tradition. One of the oldest and most fascinating examples is something called hoshigaki. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a dried persimmon hanging from a string. Yet creating one requires remarkable patience. Every autumn, ripe persimmons are carefully peeled by hand. Each fruit is tied with string and hung beneath the eaves of homes where cool autumn air slowly removes moisture. But the process doesn't end there. Every few days, each persimmon is gently massaged. Not squeezed, not pressed, massaged. The careful handling redistributes moisture inside the fruit while encouraging natural sugars to spread evenly. Week after week, the fruit slowly transforms. The surface wrinkles, the inside becomes soft like honey. Eventually, a delicate white coating appears. Many people mistake it for mold. It isn't. Those tiny white crystals are natural sugars rising to the surface. The fruit has essentially preserved itself. No chemicals, no refrigeration, just moving air. Time and remarkable patience. Some families have practiced this tradition for generations. The knowledge isn't written inside instruction manuals. Parents teach children. Grandparents teach grandchildren. Each autumn becomes another lesson. Each harvest, another opportunity to continue a tradition older than many nations. Drying food may seem simple today, but thousands of years ago, it represented an extraordinary scientific discovery. Remove enough water, and most harmful bacteria can no longer survive. The same principle appears throughout Japanese cuisine. Fish becomes dried bonito. Seaweed dries into lightweight sheets. Mushrooms hang beneath rooftops. Daikon radishes become long white ribbons swaying gently in winter sunlight. Even rice itself was traditionally stored after careful drying before entering household granaries. Moisture is the enemy. Dryness becomes protection. Yet drying alone cannot explain foods surviving 20 years. Another remarkable process quietly takes over: fermentation. Today, many people associate fermentation with yogurt or kombucha. Japan has practiced it for well over 1,000 years. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in miso. Made from soybeans, salt, and a remarkable mold called koji, miso begins as something surprisingly ordinary. Cooked soybeans are mashed, salt is added, koji is mixed throughout. Then everything is packed tightly into wooden barrels. Heavy stones rest on top. Air is pushed out. Darkness surrounds the mixture. Then, almost nothing happens. At least, nothing visible. Inside those barrels, millions of microscopic organisms begin extraordinary work. Proteins slowly break apart. Starches transform into sugars. New aromas emerge. Rich umami flavors develop. The paste changes month after month, year after year. Many commercial miso varieties age for 1 or 2 years. Traditional producers sometimes wait 5, 10, even 20 years. Imagine preparing food today, knowing your grandchildren may eventually enjoy it. That isn't unusual in certain parts of Japan. Time itself becomes an ingredient. The longer the fermentation continues under proper conditions, the deeper the flavor often becomes. This philosophy appears repeatedly throughout Japanese food culture. Instead of rushing nature, work with it. Instead of stopping change, guide it. Perhaps the most famous example of this thinking is soy sauce. Most supermarket bottles hide an incredible history. Authentic Japanese soy sauce begins with soybeans, roasted wheat, salt, water, and koji mold. After careful preparation, the mixture ferments inside enormous cedar barrels. Months pass, sometimes years. Tiny microorganisms perform countless chemical reactions impossible to reproduce instantly. Modern factories can speed the process dramatically. Traditional craftsmen often refuse. They believe time cannot be replaced. Flavor cannot be rushed. Patience becomes craftsmanship. Visitors to centuries-old soy sauce breweries often notice something unusual. The buildings themselves seem alive. The wooden barrels have absorbed generations of beneficial microorganisms. Each new batch inherits invisible communities developed across hundreds of years. Some breweries still use barrels older than the countries importing their products. The barrels aren't simply containers, they're part of the recipe. Perhaps that's the greatest difference between traditional Japanese preservation and modern food production. Modern industry often asks, how can we make this faster? Traditional preservation asks, how can we make this better? Sometimes, the answer requires waiting years, not because the food cannot be eaten sooner, but because excellence cannot be hurried. The remarkable part is that these methods don't merely preserve food, they transform it. Fresh soybeans taste nothing like mature miso. Fresh wheat resembles soy sauce in almost no way. Simple ingredients become something entirely different through patience alone. In many respects, Japanese preservation isn't really about preventing food from changing. It's about allowing food to become its very best version. That idea has quietly shaped Japanese kitchens for centuries, and it's only the beginning. Because some of Japan's oldest preservation techniques become even more astonishing when salt, rice, fish, and carefully controlled aging come together to create foods capable of lasting for decades. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. What's the longest you've ever kept food before eating it? Let me know in the comments. You may be surprised how short that time is compared to some of Japan's oldest preserved foods. By now, one thing has become clear. Japanese food preservation was never about stopping time. It was about understanding it. Every method we explored worked with nature instead of fighting against it. Drying removed moisture. Fermentation encouraged beneficial microorganisms. Patience allowed flavors to mature. But perhaps no Japanese preservation technique surprises people more than what happens with fish. Most of us think of fish as one of the most fragile foods on Earth. Leave it unrefrigerated for only a few hours, and it begins to spoil. That's why modern supermarkets keep seafood buried under ice. Restaurants carefully monitor temperatures. Fishing boats race back to shore before their catch loses freshness. Yet for centuries, Japanese communities preserved fish for months, sometimes years, without a single block of ice. The secret was salt, lots of it. Salt has been one of humanity's greatest preservatives for thousands of years. But Japan refined its use into something remarkably sophisticated. Fresh fish were cleaned immediately after being caught. Every trace of blood and unnecessary moisture was carefully removed. Then, generous amounts of sea salt covered every surface. The salt immediately began pulling water from the flesh through osmosis. As moisture left the fish, bacteria lost one of the essential conditions they needed to survive. Without enough available water, most harmful microorganisms simply couldn't multiply. But Japanese craftsmen didn't stop there. Many salted fish were then hung in cool mountain air to dry even further. Others were smoked over carefully selected woods. Each additional step removed more moisture while creating new layers of flavor. The result wasn't merely preserved fish. It became something entirely different. One remarkable example is katsuobushi, often called one of the hardest foods in the world. It begins as bonito, a type of tuna. After being filleted, the fish is simmered, smoked repeatedly over several weeks, and then carefully fermented with beneficial molds. The molds grow, they're brushed away, they grow again they're removed. This cycle repeats over and over, slowly drawing out every remaining trace of moisture. Eventually, the fish becomes so hard that slicing it with an ordinary kitchen knife becomes almost impossible. Traditional craftsmen shave paper-thin flakes using tools that resemble woodworking planes. Those delicate flakes later become the foundation of dashi, the broth that gives Japanese cuisine much of its famous umami flavor. What's astonishing is not only the taste, it's the longevity. Properly prepared katsuobushi can remain stable for years because almost nothing remains inside that bacteria can use to survive. Once again, time itself becomes part of the recipe. The same philosophy appears in another extraordinary Japanese tradition, pickling. Most people imagine pickles as cucumbers floating in vinegar. Japan created an entire world beyond that simple idea. Vegetables are preserved using salt. Rice bran, miso, soy sauce, sake lees, even combinations of all of them. Each method creates unique flavors while extending shelf life dramatically. One of the oldest examples is nukazuke. At first glance, the process seems surprisingly strange. Rice bran, salt, water, and beneficial microorganisms are mixed into a living fermentation bed. Vegetables are buried inside. Every single day, someone mixes the bed by hand. Not occasionally, every day. Why? Because the fermentation itself is alive. The microorganisms require oxygen distributed evenly throughout the mixture. Ignoring the bed for too long weakens the entire ecosystem. Many Japanese families cared for these fermentation beds almost like members of the household. Some have remained active for generations. Imagine preparing today's vegetables inside the very same fermentation bed your great-grandparents once used. The microorganisms living there have been passed from one generation to the next. The family doesn't simply inherit recipes, it inherits living cultures. That remarkable continuity reflects something deeply rooted within Japanese tradition. Food preservation isn't only about survival, it's about continuity. Every batch connects the present with the past. Perhaps no preserved food illustrates patience more dramatically than umeboshi. These intensely salty preserved plums have been part of Japanese life for well over 1,000 years. Fresh ume fruits are harvested while still firm. They're layered generously with salt and placed beneath heavy weights. Slowly, liquid is drawn from the fruit. Natural fermentation begins. Later, many are colored naturally using red shiso leaves before drying beneath the summer sun. The finished umeboshi possess an astonishing shelf life. Because of their high salt concentration and careful preparation, properly stored umeboshi can remain edible for decades. In fact, some families deliberately keep older batches untouched. Traditional Japanese belief often held that aged umeboshi developed richer medicinal qualities with time. Even today, jars containing umeboshi aged for 10 or 20 years are considered valuable treasures in certain households. Imagine opening a jar prepared by your parents decades earlier. The food becomes more than nourishment, it becomes memory. Another extraordinary example comes from one of Japan's oldest forms of preserved fish. Known as nare-sushi, this ancient preparation predates modern sushi by centuries. Many people assume sushi has always involved fresh fish served over rice. Originally, it was something entirely different. Fresh fish were packed with salt and layered beneath cooked rice. Heavy weights compressed everything tightly. Then people waited, not for days, not for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes over a year. During that time, lactic acid bacteria fermented the rice naturally. The increasing acidity protected the fish while transforming its flavor. Originally, the rice itself wasn't even eaten. Its purpose was preservation. Only the fish remained. Modern sushi eventually evolved from these early preservation techniques. One of the world's most famous foods began not as fast food, but as survival food. History often works that way. Necessity quietly becomes tradition. Tradition eventually becomes culture. Then culture spreads around the world. Even Japanese tea played an unexpected role in preservation. Certain tea leaves naturally contain compounds that slow oxidation and microbial growth. These antioxidant properties helped protect foods while contributing additional flavor. Seaweed offered another remarkable advantage. After careful drying, it remained lightweight, compact, and stable for incredibly long periods. Communities harvested seaweed during favorable seasons, dried it naturally, and stored it until needed months later. Rice itself required extraordinary attention. Freshly harvested rice contains enough moisture to spoil if carelessly stored. Traditional Japanese farmers understood this well. Harvested rice was dried slowly before entering elevated storehouses carefully designed to reduce humidity and discourage insects. Every detail mattered. Air circulation, temperature, moisture. Nothing happened by accident. Perhaps the most impressive lesson hidden within all these methods is that Japanese preservation rarely depended on a single technique. Salt might begin the process. Drying continued it. Fermentation completed it. Each method strengthened the next, layer after layer. Nature itself became the guardian of the food. Modern food preservation often depends entirely on machines: electricity, compressors, freezers, thermostats. Traditional Japanese preservation depended on observation, knowing when humidity changed, recognizing subtle aromas, feeling texture with experienced hands, watching how seasons influenced fermentation. These weren't simply recipes, they were relationships with nature built over generations. That knowledge became especially important whenever disaster struck. Japan has experienced countless earthquakes, typhoons, poor harvests, and periods of war throughout its history. Families with preserved foods possessed something more valuable than convenience. They possessed security. While fresh crops failed, the pantry remained full. While storms delayed fishing boats, meals continued, prepared years earlier. Food quietly protected future generations. Perhaps that explains why traditional preservation methods survived even after refrigeration became common. Many Japanese families didn't abandon these techniques because they were never only about necessity, they were about flavor, heritage, patience, respect. A refrigerator can slow spoilage, but it cannot create 20 years of careful aging. It cannot reproduce centuries-old fermentation cultures. It cannot replace knowledge passed carefully from grandparent to grandchild. Technology changed storage. It never replaced wisdom. And nowhere is that wisdom more extraordinary than in Japan's oldest fermented foods, some of which continue changing, improving, and increasing in value long after most modern foods would have been thrown away. In the final part of our story, we'll discover why some Japanese foods are intentionally aged for 20 years or more, explore the surprising science that allows them to remain safe without refrigeration, and uncover the timeless philosophy that transformed food preservation into one of Japan's greatest cultural traditions. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Which method amazed you the most? Fish preserved until it's harder than wood? Vegetables fermented in living rice bran beds passed down for generations? Or salty umeboshi that can last for decades? Share your answer in the comments. I read every one, and I'd love to know which Japanese preservation secret surprised you the most. After exploring Japan's oldest preservation methods, one question still remains. How can food possibly survive for 20 years without refrigeration? The answer may surprise you. It isn't because these foods somehow escape nature. It's because they work with it so completely that harmful microorganisms simply lose the conditions they need to survive. Every successful preservation method follows the same principle. Remove enough moisture, control oxygen, increase natural acidity, or allow beneficial microorganisms to outcompete harmful ones. Once those conditions are carefully balanced, time becomes far less dangerous than most people imagine. In fact, time often becomes an advantage. Modern food companies usually compete to make products faster. Traditional Japanese craftsmen often compete to make them better. And sometimes, better requires waiting. Consider long-aged miso once again. Most commercial varieties are ready within a year or two, but certain traditional producers continue aging their miso for 10, 15, even 20 years. During those long years, proteins continue breaking down into amino acids. Natural sugars slowly develop. Complex aromas emerge one layer at a time. The color gradually darkens from pale gold to a rich reddish brown. Open a barrel after 2 decades, and what remains barely resembles the soybeans placed inside years earlier. The transformation is extraordinary. Not because anything artificial has been added, but because nature has simply been given enough time to finish its work. The same philosophy appears in Japanese soy sauce breweries that still use centuries-old cedar barrels. Some of these barrels have been used continuously for generations. Inside the wood lives an invisible community of beneficial microorganisms. Every new batch inherits that living ecosystem. The barrels themselves have become part of the fermentation. They are no longer simple containers, they are active participants. Replacing them with stainless steel might increase efficiency, but many traditional brewers believe something irreplaceable would be lost. Sometimes the oldest tools produce the finest results. Another remarkable example comes from aged umeboshi. Most people expect preserved food to lose quality over time. Traditional Japanese households often believe the opposite. Properly stored umeboshi continue changing very slowly for many years. Their sharp saltiness gradually softens. Their flavors become deeper and more balanced. Some families carefully protect jars prepared decades earlier, opening them only during special occasions or sharing them with younger generations as a symbol of continuity. Imagine tasting fruit your grandparents preserved before you were born. That experience isn't simply about eating, it's about connecting with family history. Food becomes memory preserved inside a jar. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden within Japanese preservation. The goal was never simply survival, it was continuity. Every preserved ingredient represented a promise that today's harvest would still nourish tomorrow's family, a promise that knowledge would survive from one generation to the next. Parents taught children how to judge humidity by touch, how to recognize healthy fermentation by smell, how to know exactly when drying was complete. These skills rarely came from books. They came through observation, patience, practice, one season after another. That patient approach feels surprisingly unfamiliar today. Modern life teaches us to expect instant results. Meals arrive in minutes. Groceries arrive the same day. If something spoils, we simply replace it. Traditional Japan followed a very different rhythm. Families planned months ahead, sometimes years ahead. Food preservation wasn't a weekend hobby, it was part of everyday life. Each season prepared for the next. Spring anticipated winter. Autumn protected the coming year. Nothing happened by accident. Even today, despite refrigerators in nearly every home, many of these traditions continue. Not because electricity failed, but because the food simply tastes better. Professional chefs still seek naturally fermented soy sauce aged in wooden barrels. Artisan miso continues attracting people willing to wait years for exceptional flavor. Traditional pickles remain prized for their complexity. Dried persimmons still appear each autumn beneath the eaves of homes across rural Japan. These foods have survived modernization because quality never goes out of style. Perhaps that's why Japanese preservation continues fascinating scientists as well. Modern research has confirmed much of what generations already understood through experience. Fermentation creates beneficial compounds. Drying prevents microbial growth. Salt controls harmful bacteria. Natural acids protect food remarkably well. The science eventually caught up with the tradition, but the people practicing these methods never needed laboratory equipment to recognize their value. They trusted observation, season after season, generation after generation. There is another lesson quietly hidden inside this story. Preservation isn't only about food, it's about respecting abundance. When harvests were plentiful, families didn't celebrate by wasting, they celebrated by preparing. Every dried mushroom, every barrel of miso, every carefully packed pickle, every hanging persimmon represented gratitude for what nature had provided. Nothing deserved to be wasted. That philosophy feels remarkably relevant today. In a world where enormous amounts of food are discarded every year, these ancient techniques remind us that preservation begins with appreciation. When we value food, we naturally learn how to care for it. Perhaps that explains why so many Japanese preservation methods have survived for centuries. They aren't merely recipes, they're expressions of patience, respect, responsibility. The refrigerator changed how humanity stores food. It never replaced the wisdom that came before it. And maybe that's the real secret behind Japanese food lasting 20 years without refrigeration. It was never magic. It was never a hidden chemical. It wasn't even extraordinary technology. It was thousands of years of careful observation, passed quietly from one generation to another, proving that sometimes the greatest innovation isn't inventing something new, it's refusing to forget what already works. The next time you open your refrigerator, remember that for most of human history, people protected their harvests without humming machines or digital temperature controls. They relied on nature. They trusted time. And in Japan, they transformed patience into one of the greatest food preservation traditions the world has ever known. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which Japanese preservation method amazed you the most? And would you ever try making one of these traditional foods yourself? Share your answer in the comments below. I read every comment, and I'd love to know which ancient technique surprised you the most. If you enjoy discovering forgotten traditions, ancient food wisdom, and the remarkable history hidden behind everyday life, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more incredible stories from around the world waiting to be uncovered, and I can't wait to share them with you.